They turned him away without a thought, and that single moment would stain the memory of the town longer than any name carved in stone. Elias Crow stood at the edge of the wooden boardwalk as the late afternoon sun slid low behind the grain silos, painting the street in a pale, dusty gold that made everything look kinder than it was. He had walked 12 miles that day, boots worn thin at the heels, hat pulled low not to hide his face but to keep the glare out of his eyes, and when he reached the hotel door, he paused the way a man does when he already knows the answer but asks anyway. The clerk barely looked up. No vacancy. The words came out flat, practiced, as if they belonged to the building more than the man saying them. Elias nodded once, not in defeat, just in acknowledgement, and stepped back into the heat while the door closed with a soft, final click that echoed louder than it should have. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't remind anyone that the sign outside had been flipped an hour earlier or that the other rooms had lights burning behind the curtains. He simply adjusted the strap of the small canvas bag slung over his shoulder and moved down the street, past the general store where a few men leaned against barrels, laughing about something that didn't matter, past the saloon where music leaked out like warmth he hadn't been invited to share. Someone glanced at him and then looked away, the way people do when they decide another person is none of their concern. Sheriff Thomas Hale saw him then, standing near the hitching post, one hand resting on the brim of his hat, the badge on his chest catching the light. Hale had a choice in that moment, though he would later tell himself he didn't. He could have said something simple. He could have asked a question. Instead, he watched Elias pass and did nothing, and the doing nothing settled into the town like dust, unnoticed at first, then everywhere. Elias walked beyond the last storefront to where the buildings thinned and the open land began, the kind of place where sounds travel far and silence carries weight. He stopped near a fence line, looking back once at the town that had decided, quietly, and together, that he belonged somewhere else. There was no anger in his face, only a calm that comes from long habits of self-reliance, from knowing how often doors close for reasons that are never explained. He found a spot where the ground dipped slightly, offering a little shelter from the wind, and set his bag down carefully, as if it contained something fragile, something worth protecting. As evening stretched and the lights in town grew brighter, the space between those lights and where Elias sat felt wider than the miles he had walked to get there. Somewhere a bell rang for supper. Somewhere someone told a story, and everyone laughed at the right moment. Out here, Elias Crow waited, not for help, not for mercy, but for the night to pass, unaware that the smallest refusal, given without thought, had already begun to work its way into the conscience of a place that would never again remember itself the same way. Morning revealed the town the way it always did, slowly and without apology, the sun lifting over the low hills and spilling light across Main Street until every window, every sign, every scuffed plank looked honest again. This was a place that measured itself by routine, by the steady opening of shops at 8, by the smell of coffee drifting from the diner, by the belief that order alone was proof of virtue. Sheriff Thomas Hale walked his usual route from his house to the office, boots striking the boardwalk at the same pace he had kept for years, nodding to the same faces, returning the same greetings. He told himself it was a good town. He had told himself that for a long time. The hardware store unlocked its door. The bank clerk straightened the ledgers. A farmer counted out feed by the pound and complained about the price, and everyone agreed with him. Nothing appeared out of place, and that was the problem. At the edge of town, beyond the last fence and the last hitching rail, Elias Crow sat where he had waited through the night, the ground cool beneath him, the sky pale and endless above. He had slept little, not from fear but from habit, waking at every shift of wind, every distant sound, the way men do when they have learned not to depend on walls. He rinsed his face with water from his canteen, careful not to waste a drop, then folded his blanket and secured it with practiced hands. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if time owed him nothing and he expected nothing in return. From where he stood, the town looked smaller in daylight, less certain of itself, its straight lines softened by distance. Back on Main Street, the hotel clerk stepped outside to flip the sign, pausing when he noticed the extra light under the eastern sky, thinking about nothing more serious than whether the day would be busy. A woman swept dust from her doorstep, pushing it into the street where it would settle again by noon. Two boys ran past, arguing about whose turn it was to pitch first, their laughter sharp and clean, unburdened by memory. Sheriff Hale reached his office and stopped, one hand on the doorframe, a thought catching where none usually did. He looked down the street, then back the way he had come, an image rising uninvited of a man standing quietly as a door closed in his face. Hale dismissed it, the way people dismiss discomfort, by giving it a name that made it smaller. A stranger. A full house. Not his responsibility. He stepped inside and hung his hat on its peg, the badge on his chest dull in the morning light. Elias Crow took one last look toward town, not in resentment, not in hope, but in recognition, as if committing the shape of the place to memory. Then he turned away and started walking, the road stretching ahead of him in a long, honest line. Each step carried him farther from the voices, the doors, the easy judgments made before supper and forgotten by morning. Behind him, the town went on believing it had done nothing at all, unaware that the day had already begun to measure it by something other than its routines. Elias Crow had not always been a man passing through towns without leaving a mark, and the road he followed now had once led somewhere specific, somewhere with a name written in careful ink on a deed that no longer existed. He had grown up knowing the weight of work, the kind that starts before sunrise and ends when the light is gone, measured not in hours but in what still needs doing. His father taught him that a man's word mattered, because it was often the only thing he owned outright, and Elias carried that lesson the way others carried a family Bible, worn but intact. Years earlier, he had held steady employment on a ranch 30 miles west of here, a place with windmills that groaned all night and fences that never stayed straight for long. He had slept under a solid roof then, eaten meals at a table with other men, spoken little and listened more, earning trust the slow way. When the ranch changed hands, as places do, there was no argument, no dramatic parting, just a quiet understanding that his work was finished there. He took his pay, shook hands, and moved on, believing the world still ran on simple exchanges. That belief had carried him across counties and seasons, through towns that looked like this one and towns that did not bother to hide their suspicion. He learned how to make himself small without losing himself, how to accept refusal without letting it turn into bitterness. The canvas bag he carried held everything he considered necessary: a spare shirt, a folded blanket, a few papers tied with twine, and a small tin with a photograph worn smooth at the edges from being handled too often. He did not look at it now, but its weight was familiar, a reminder that he had once belonged somewhere that did not require explanation. As he walked farther from town, the road stretching ahead in pale dust, he listened to the land the way some men listen to conversation, reading the slope of the ground, the direction of the wind, the distance between fence posts. He was not lost. He simply had nowhere he needed to arrive by nightfall. Behind him, the town continued to define him without knowing it, reducing him to a moment at a doorway, to a decision made without malice and therefore without guilt. In Sheriff Hale's office, the morning wore on, papers were sorted, a dispute over a property line was settled with a handshake, and Hale told himself again that order was the same as fairness. He did not know Elias Crow's name. He did not know the years that had shaped the man he had watched pass. He knew only that the town had kept moving, and he had allowed himself to move with it. Elias walked until the sun climbed higher and the sounds of town faded completely, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own steps. Each mile put distance between him and a place that had already decided his value, and with that distance came a quiet clarity. He had been turned away, yes, but he had also been seen, and sometimes being seen, even briefly, was enough to leave something behind. By mid-afternoon, the town had settled back into itself, convinced that whatever had happened the night before belonged to the past simply because the sun had risen again. The hotel clerk told the same story twice, once to the grocer and once to a man passing through, each time softening the edges until it sounded less like refusal and more like circumstance. Full house, nothing personal, that sort of thing. The words came easily, practiced until they no longer carried weight. At the diner, coffee cups were refilled, and a waitress remarked that she had seen the stranger walk out of town early, as if that explained everything. Someone shrugged. People passed through. That was the unspoken agreement. That movement itself erased responsibility. Sheriff Thomas Hale spent the afternoon answering minor complaints, listening to a rancher argue about a missing tool, reminding a shop owner about a permit that needed renewing. He did his job well, the way he always had, and that competence reassured him. A good man in a good town, keeping things orderly. When his eyes drifted to the edge of town where the road disappeared into open land, he felt the briefest pull of unease, quickly replaced by logic. He had not forced anyone away. He had simply allowed things to happen as they always did. Elias Crow was miles from there now, his shadow short beneath the high sun, his pace steady. The land did not ask him questions or make judgments. It offered what it always offered: dust, distance, and the simple honesty of effort. He stopped once to rest near a stand of scrub trees, drinking carefully from his canteen, then continued on, his thoughts moving in quiet circles. He did not dwell on the closed door or the averted eyes, but neither did he forget them. Such moments had a way of staying with a man, not as wounds but as measurements, proof of how little it took to be dismissed. Back in town, the hotel door opened and closed. Throughout the afternoon, guests coming and going, keys exchanged, laughter drifting out onto the street. No one mentioned the stranger again, and that silence felt like resolution. It was easier to believe that nothing had been done wrong if nothing was said at all. Sheriff Hale finished his rounds and stepped outside, the heat pressing down, the badge on his chest warm to the touch. He removed his hat and wiped his brow, watching dust swirl lazily in the street. For a moment, he imagined walking out to the edge of town, calling after the man he had seen the night before, offering a simple word, anything to balance what had been withheld. The thought passed. There were rules, expectations, and understanding of how things worked. Intervening now would only complicate matters. As evening approached, the town prepared for another ordinary night. Lamps were lit, supper tables set, conversations resumed where they had left off. Somewhere beyond the last fence, Elias Crow continued on, carrying with him the quiet knowledge of how easily people could decide another man did not belong. And in the town behind him, that decision settled deeper, unchallenged, becoming part of the place itself, a small, unexamined cruelty that would not announce itself until much later, when remembering it would be unavoidable. The following day arrived with a change in the air that no one could name, but many felt, a slight heaviness that settled over the town as if the sky itself were holding something back. Sheriff Thomas Hale woke earlier than usual, the habit of years drawing him from bed before the sun fully cleared the horizon. He dressed without thought, the motions familiar, automatic, but when he pinned his badge in place, his fingers lingered a moment longer than they ever had before. He told himself it was nothing. Age, perhaps, or the heat. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that came not from peace but from anticipation. As he walked toward his office, he noticed small things he usually ignored: a shutter hanging crooked, a loose board on the boardwalk, the way a man crossing the street avoided his eyes. None of it amounted to anything on its own, yet together it formed an unease he could not shake. In the office, a letter waited on his desk, delivered early by the post-rider, its envelope plain, the handwriting careful and deliberate. Hale opened it expecting routine business, but the words inside gave him pause. It spoke of a boundary dispute west of town, a claim that had been overlooked, a request for acknowledgement. The name signed at the bottom was Elias Crow. Hale read it twice, then a third time, the sound of the name echoing in his mind with unexpected weight. He could not remember when the letter had been written, only that it must have been carried before the man ever reached town. The realization settled slowly, uncomfortable in its implications. Elias Crow had not been asking for charity. He had been passing through on legitimate business, seeking nothing more than a place to rest while matters beyond the town were sorted. Hale folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk, staring at the grain of the wood as if it might offer guidance. Around him, the town went about its morning, unaware of the shift taking place behind his eyes. Elias, meanwhile, had reached a crossroads miles away, where the main road split towards smaller settlements that did not bother with signs. He paused there, considering his options, the letter no longer in his possession but its purpose still clear in his mind. He had done what he believed was right, trusting that process mattered, that patience would be met with fairness. The night spent outside the town had not altered that belief, but it had tempered it, adding a layer of caution earned through experience. He chose a direction and continued on. The decision made with the same quiet certainty that guided all his choices. Back in town, Sheriff Hale stood and looked out his office window, the letter's contents replaying in his thoughts. For the first time, the memory of the closed door and the averted eyes did not feel abstract. It felt personal, tied to his name and his role. He understood then that doing nothing had been a choice, one that could no longer be dismissed as neutrality. The town had turned someone away without knowing who he was, and in that ignorance lay a failure that now demanded acknowledgement. Hale put on his hat and stepped outside, the sun climbing higher, the day pressing forward, carrying with it the slow, inevitable approach of consequence. For a brief stretch of time, everything appeared to settle, as if the town itself had decided to smooth over the rough edge left behind by the stranger's passing. The days followed one another with dependable sameness, warm afternoons, mild evenings, conversations repeating themselves in different mouths. Sheriff Thomas Hale carried out his duties with renewed precision, correcting small oversights, answering questions before they were asked, making a point of standing a little longer when people spoke to him. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like diligence, the mark of a man committed to his role. Inside, however, Hale felt the quiet tension of a balance not quite restored. He had not spoken of the letter. He had not told anyone about the name signed at the bottom or the implication that the town's casual refusal had brushed against something legitimate and undeserved. Silence, he told himself, was sometimes necessary. Time would dull the significance. Elias Crow continued on his chosen road, stopping where work was offered, trading labor for meals, keeping his presence measured and unobtrusive. In one small settlement, he repaired a broken fence and was thanked without ceremony. In another, he helped unload supplies from a wagon and was given a place to sleep in a shed that smelled of hay and clean wood. These exchanges reaffirmed what he already knew, that fairness still existed, unevenly distributed but not entirely absent. The memory of the town that had turned him away faded into the background of his thoughts, not erased but filed away with other moments that had shaped his expectations. Back home, the hotel filled and emptied again, keys changing hands, linens aired out in the sun. The clerk spoke cheerfully to guests, his voice free of doubt. The saloon rang with laughter most nights, music drifting through open windows, men leaning back in their chairs, confident in their belonging. Even Sheriff Hale began to feel the edge of unease dull, replaced by routine. He told himself that if there had been a wrong, it had passed, that the world had a way of correcting itself without intervention. Then, one afternoon, a man arrived from the west with dust on his coat and a careful manner of speaking. He asked questions about land boundaries and old claims, his tone polite but persistent. Hale listened, heart steady, answering as best he could, until the conversation turned toward a name he had not heard spoken aloud since reading the letter. Elias Crow. The sound of it in another man's voice brought back the image with unwelcome clarity, the closed door, the road beyond town. Hale maintained his composure, nodding, making notes, promising to look into the matter. The visitor thanked him and left, unaware of the shift he had caused. That evening, as the sun dropped low and the town prepared for supper, Hale remained in his office, staring at the letter once more. The calm he had relied on felt thinner now, stretched over something unresolved. Elsewhere, Elias sat by a small fire outside a settlement he did not intend to stay in, the flames low, controlled, enough to warm but not to draw attention. He watched the sky darken, the stars appearing one by one, and felt the steady assurance that comes from having done what he could. Neither man knew it yet, but the quiet they were both inhabiting was temporary, a pause before memory insisted on being acknowledged. The next morning brought with it an uneasy stillness that felt different from the calm before, a stillness that lingered too long in the corners of the day. The town woke as it always did, but conversations hesitated before finding their rhythm, and familiar greetings carried a note of distraction. Sheriff Thomas Hale noticed it as he walked the length of Main Street, the way people paused when they saw him, as if weighing whether to speak. A woman outside the diner mentioned a rider spotted near the western ridge late the night before, someone unfamiliar who had not come into town. Another man remarked on a fence found open where it had always been closed. Nothing serious, just odd. These were small things, easily dismissed, yet together they formed a pattern that resisted explanation. Hale listened without comment, his expression neutral, but inside he felt the pressure of unasked questions. The name Elias Crow returned to him unbidden, connected now to the land beyond town, to boundaries and claims that suddenly seemed less abstract. He spent the morning reviewing old records, maps yellowed with age, notes written by men long gone. Each page turned added weight to what he had begun to suspect, that the stranger turned away had been more than a passing figure, that his presence intersected with matters the town preferred to forget. Outside, the hotel clerk argued quietly with a supplier over a delayed delivery, frustration sharper than usual. At the saloon, the piano sat untouched longer than it should have, the room subdued even before noon. People felt it, the sense that something unresolved hovered just beyond their routines. Miles away, Elias Crow approached another settlement, smaller than the last, its buildings scattered and unassuming. He stopped at a well on the outskirts, drawing water with steady hands, nodding to a man passing by. There was no tension here, no sudden judgment, just the plain acknowledgement of one person to another. Elias felt the contrast without lingering on it. He had learned not to compare too closely, knowing that such comparisons only sharpened disappointment. As he rested, he noticed tracks leading off the main road, fresh enough to catch his attention. Someone else was moving through this area with purpose. He did not follow them, but he remembered their direction, filing the detail away. Back in town, Sheriff Hale closed the ledger he had been studying and leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood loud in the quiet office. He understood now that the town's calm had been built on omission, on the assumption that what was not addressed would remain insignificant. The unease spreading through the streets was not about danger, but about recognition, the slow dawning that a line had been crossed without acknowledgement. Hale stood and looked out the window toward the road leading west, the same road Elias Crow had taken days earlier. The distance between them felt shorter now, not measured in miles, but in consequence. As afternoon wore on, clouds gathered on the horizon, thin and high, promising change without specifying its nature. The town continued to move, but beneath every action ran the quiet awareness that the pause could not last, that the small, ordinary signs accumulating around them pointed toward a reckoning that would arrive without force, carried instead by memory and truth. The arrival came without spectacle, marked not by noise but by the simple fact that people noticed at the same time, a pair of riders easing into town from the western road just as the afternoon light began to soften. They rode steady, unhurried, their horses clean and well kept, the kind that suggested purpose rather than urgency. Word moved faster than they did, passing from doorway to doorway, carried on lowered voices and curious glances. Sheriff Thomas. Hale stepped out of his office as they dismounted, recognizing the seal on the saddlebags before a word was spoken. County men. Surveyors by the look of them, the sort who measured land with chains and numbers and had no patience for guesswork. They greeted Hale politely, removing their hats, and asked for a place to sit and unroll their maps. Inside the office, papers were spread across the desk, lines drawn with careful precision, boundaries marked that did not align with the town's casual assumptions. One of the men spoke calmly, explaining that they were following up on a claim filed weeks earlier, one that required acknowledgement before further development could proceed. He said the name as if it were ordinary, Elias Crow, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, people lingered under the pretense of errands, waiting for something they could not define. The hotel clerk paused mid-conversation. The diner door remained open longer than necessary. No one asked questions directly, but everyone listened. Sheriff Hale felt the weight of the moment settle fully now, the private unease he had carried becoming a public presence. He answered what he could, his voice steady, but each response drew the town closer to the truth it had avoided. The claim, it turned out, concerned land just beyond town, property that had been absorbed into local use without formal resolution, a matter overlooked because it was easier not to look. The surveyors explained that Crow had been patient, that he had followed procedure, trusting that fairness would emerge from documentation and time. When asked where the claimant might be found, Hale hesitated, the pause speaking louder than any admission. He said only that the man had passed through recently. Outside, the murmur grew, not loud enough to be called a crowd, but enough to be felt. Faces reflected confusion, then recognition, then something closer to shame. The stranger at the door was no longer a stranger. He was a name on a map, a line drawn with intention, a reminder that ignoring a person did not erase their claim. Miles away, Elias Crow felt nothing of this yet, unaware that his name was being spoken with new care, that the road he had taken led back into the town's consciousness without his presence. The surveyors rolled up their maps and prepared to stay the night. Business unfinished, the matter requiring cooperation. As they stepped back onto the street, the town seemed to shift around them, its familiar routines disrupted by the quiet arrival of accountability. Sheriff Hale watched them go, understanding that the pause was over, that what had been turned away was now returning, not with accusation or force, but with the simple, undeniable weight of truth. That night, sleep came unevenly to the town, settling in shallow layers that broke at the smallest sound. Lamps were turned down earlier than usual, conversations cut short, doors closed with more care than habit required. Sheriff Thomas Hale lay awake longer than he cared to admit, staring at the dark ceiling, the quiet weight of the day pressing against him. He replayed the moment the name had been spoken in his office, the calm certainty of the surveyors, the maps laid bare on his desk like evidence that did not accuse but simply existed. For years, Hale had believed that fairness was something maintained by keeping things orderly, by preventing disruption. Now he understood that order could also conceal neglect, that a smooth surface often hid what had been pushed aside. Before dawn, he rose and dressed, the house silent around him, and stepped outside to breathe the cool air. The town looked smaller at that hour, less sure of itself, its straight streets softened by shadow. He walked without destination, passing the hotel, the diner, the closed saloon, each place suddenly marked by memory. At the edge of town, where the road stretched west, Hale stopped, imagining Elias Crow standing there days earlier, holding his ground quietly while a decision was made around him. The image no longer faded when Hale tried to dismiss it. Morning arrived, gray and subdued, clouds hanging low enough to touch the rooftops. The surveyors returned to Hale's office with questions, polite but persistent, asking for access to records, for assistance locating boundaries that had been assumed rather than confirmed. Hale complied, pulling files that had not been opened in years, feeling the subtle shift as cooperation replaced avoidance. Outside, word spread with clarity now, no longer rumor but understanding. People spoke Elias Crow's name with caution, connecting it to the night he had been turned away, to the road he had taken out of town. The hotel clerk stood in the doorway longer than usual, his earlier explanations sounding thin even to himself. At the diner, the waitress paused mid-pour, staring into a coffee cup as if it held an answer she had missed. The town was not angry. It was unsettled, confronted with the realization that it had mistaken convenience for justification. Miles away, Elias moved through another day of work, unaware of the shift he had caused simply by following procedure and accepting refusal without protest. He helped repair a windmill that morning, tightening bolts, aligning blades, the repetitive motion grounding him. When the job was done, he washed his hands and accepted his pay, nodding in thanks, feeling the familiar satisfaction of exchange completed fairly. He thought briefly of the town he had left behind, not with resentment, but with curiosity, wondering if it would ever understand what it had decided so easily. Back home, Sheriff Hale stood before the gathered records, the surveyors at his side, and felt the full measure of his responsibility settle into place. This was not about land alone. It was about acknowledgement, about the quiet harm done when a person was reduced to inconvenience. As the morning wore on, Hale made a decision that required no announcement. He would see the matter through. He would not allow the town to forget. Outside, the clouds thinned, light filtering through in narrow bands, illuminating the street in fragments, as if revealing the place piece by piece, ready or not. The truth emerged not as a revelation, but as a sequence of confirmations, each one quiet, each one impossible to dismiss, once placed beside the others. Over the next 2 days, the surveyors walked the land with chains and stakes, their measurements steady, impartial, indifferent to local habit. Lines were marked where no one remembered lines being, corners identified that had long been treated as conveniences rather than facts. Sheriff Thomas Hale accompanied them part of the way, listening more than he spoke, watching as assumptions were replaced with numbers that did not bend to preference. The claim was valid. The paperwork was in order. Elias Crow had followed every requirement asked of him, submitting notices, wading through delays, trusting that recognition would come without confrontation. The land in question, modest and unremarkable to most eyes, had been used by the town without formal right, folded into daily life because it was easier to forget how it had been acquired. When the findings were shared, there was no shouting, no denial that could hold. People gathered in small groups, voices low, faces thoughtful. The hotel clerk stood apart, arms crossed, replaying the moment he had closed the door on a man whose patience now stood in stark contrast to his own haste. At the diner, the waitress shook her head slowly, realizing that the stranger she had dismissed had been carrying more legitimacy than many who claimed belonging by habit alone. Sheriff Hale called a meeting, not out of obligation, but necessity. He stood before the townspeople with the maps displayed behind him, the lines clear even to those who did not understand surveying. He spoke plainly, without accusation, explaining what had been overlooked and what now needed to be addressed. He did not defend himself. He did not assign blame. He acknowledged the failure as collective, his voice steady, his posture unguarded. The silence that followed was not hostile but heavy, filled with recognition. No one asked why the man had been turned away. They already knew. The question now was what it meant. Miles away, Elias Crow finished his work in another settlement and prepared to move on again, unaware that his name was being spoken with a new respect, that his quiet persistence had forced a reckoning without his presence. He folded his papers carefully, the edges worn but intact, and placed them back in his bag. He did not expect an apology. He did not expect recompense beyond what was due. He had learned long ago not to hinge his sense of worth on the acknowledgement of others. Back in town, plans were discussed, adjustments proposed, cooperation offered. The land would be returned or fairly compensated. Records would be corrected. None of it felt like punishment. It felt like belated honesty. Sheriff Hale removed his hat as the meeting ended, holding it against his chest for a moment longer than necessary. He understood now that justice did not always arrive with force or finality. Sometimes it arrived with clarity, stripping away the comfort of ignorance and leaving behind the responsibility to remember. The town began that process quietly, aware that forgetting again would no longer be possible. The days that followed did not bring celebration or relief, only a slow recalibration of how the town understood itself. Adjustments were made quietly, ledgers corrected, agreements rewritten with care that bordered on reverence. Sheriff Thomas Hale oversaw the process without ceremony, present at each step, his presence steady but stripped of the easy confidence he once carried. He listened more than he spoke, allowing others to voice what had gone unsaid, the realization that they had mistaken familiarity for right. No one argued the facts now. The truth had settled too firmly for that. Instead, conversations turned inward, people measuring their own moments of silence against the cost of speaking sooner. The hotel clerk began offering rooms more cautiously, asking questions he had once dismissed as unnecessary. At the diner, the waitress greeted travelers with a different tone, attentive in a way that suggested memory rather than obligation. None of these changes were announced. They simply appeared, small corrections that hinted at a deeper shift. Sheriff Hale wrote a letter in the evenings, the words coming slowly, each sentence weighed. He did not justify the town's actions. He did not excuse his own. He wrote plainly, acknowledging the refusal, the oversight, the failure to recognize a man who had earned recognition through patience rather than force. When he finished, he read it once, then folded it carefully, unsure if it would ever be sent, but knowing it needed to exist. Miles away, Elias Crow received word through indirect channels, a mention from a man passing through, a comment overheard at a supply stop, that his claim had been upheld, that the town had corrected its records. The information reached him without apology attached, without invitation to return. Elias accepted it with the same quiet composure that had marked his response to refusal. He had not sought vindication. He had sought resolution. That it had come without his presence felt fitting. He sat one evening beneath a wide sky, the land stretching open around him, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. He did not feel triumph. He felt alignment. the rare sense that effort and outcome had finally met. Back in town, Sheriff Hale stood at the edge of Main Street as dusk settled, watching people move with familiar purpose, yet changed in subtle ways. He understood now that leadership was not about maintaining comfort, but about bearing witness to discomfort until it taught something lasting. The memory of Elias Crow remained, no longer a distant figure at a closed door, but a reference point, a measure against which future decisions would be weighed. The town did not speak his name often. It did not need to. His absence carried enough presence to shape what followed. As the lights came on and evening took hold, Hale removed his hat and held it briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement made without audience. Out here, he knew, justice had arrived without noise, carried by truth and sustained by the willingness to remember. Time moved forward with a quieter rhythm now, as if the town had learned to step more carefully. Sheriff Thomas Hale felt the change most acutely in moments when no one was watching, when routine no longer shielded him from thought. He continued his rounds, answered questions, settled disputes, but the ease with which he once inhabited his role was gone, replaced by a deliberate attention that bordered on humility. People noticed. They spoke to him differently, less out of expectation and more out of trust cautiously extended. The town itself seemed to breathe slower, pausing before decisions, remembering how quickly judgment had once been rendered without knowledge. One afternoon, Hale walked to the edge of town alone, standing where the boardwalk gave way to dirt and the road stretched outward, pale and unwavering. He did not expect to see Elias Crow there. He knew the man had continued on, carrying his life forward without waiting for acknowledgement. Still, Hale stood for a long moment, letting the wind move past him, understanding that some reckonings did not require the presence of both parties to be complete. In another place, Elias paused during his workday, looking out across open land as a storm gathered far off, distant thunder rolling low. He felt a familiar steadiness, the sense that his path, though solitary, remained aligned with his values. The resolution of his claim had affirmed something he already believed, that patience and clarity could prevail even when recognition arrived late. He did not carry anger with him. He carried experience, and the quiet assurance that his worth had never depended on a town's approval. Back home, subtle rituals emerged without agreement or instruction. The hotel clerk began keeping a single room unassigned until evening, just in case. The diner left a pot of coffee warming longer than necessary. Small gestures, easily overlooked, but meaningful to those who remembered. Sheriff Hale watched these changes with measured relief, not pride. He knew they were not acts of penance, but of awareness, the difference between reflex and intention. One evening, as dusk settled, Hale sat alone in his office, the window open, the sounds of town drifting and softened by distance. He took out the letter he had written days earlier and read it again. This time, he folded it with finality and placed it among the official records, not as correspondence sent, but as acknowledgement preserved. It belonged there, part of the town's history, a reminder written in his own hand. Outside, the first stars appeared, steady and indifferent. Hale removed his badge and set it on the desk for a moment, not out of doubt, but reflection, understanding that authority gained meaning only when tempered by conscience. Somewhere beyond the reach of memory, Elias Crow continued on his way, unaware of the quiet practices forming in a place he would likely never see again. The distance between them remained, but it no longer mattered. The lesson had taken root where it was needed, carried not by confrontation but by recognition, and held in place by the resolve to remember what happens when a man is turned away and the silence that follows is finally broken. Years later, travelers would pass through the town and sense something they could not name, a restraint in the way doors were opened, a pause before judgment was offered. The place still functioned as it always had. Businesses ran, streets filled, seasons turned, yet beneath the familiar rhythms lay an awareness earned rather than inherited. Sheriff Thomas Hale grew older in that role, his hair thinning, his stride slower, but his attention never slackened. He remained the kind of man who listened first, who asked before deciding, who remembered that authority was not proven by firmness alone. When new clerks took over at the hotel, he made no speeches, issued no warnings. He simply stood nearby one evening and watched, satisfied when questions were asked that once had not been. The town did not memorialize its lesson with plaques or proclamations. It lived with it instead. At the diner, the coffee stayed hot for anyone who needed it. At the edge of town, a small sign appeared without discussion, weathered and plain, offering shelter information rather than refusal. No one could say who put it there. It was enough that it stayed. Elias Crow did not return. His life unfolded elsewhere, marked by the same steady independence that had carried him through that town and beyond. He worked land that was finally recognized as his, modest acres that demanded attention and returned it in kind. In the evenings, he would sit and watch the light fade, thinking not of what had been denied him, but of what had been clarified. The experience had not hardened him. It had refined him, reinforcing a belief he had held quietly all along, that dignity did not require permission. On certain nights, when the wind moved just right, he thought of the road he had taken past the town and felt no bitterness, only a distant acknowledgement that his passing through had mattered in ways he would never fully see. Back in the town, Sheriff Hale stood one last time at the edge of Main Street before retiring, the road stretching west as it always had. He removed his hat and held it, a habit that had never quite left him. He did not imagine Elias standing there anymore. He did not need to. The lesson remained without the man, embedded in choice and memory. The town would forget many things, names, faces, even events that once seemed defining. It would not forget this. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, and quiet lessons had a way of lasting. Somewhere between a closed door and an unmarked road, the town had learned what it meant to be just, not by force or pride, but by the simple, enduring act of remembering to see the person standing in front of it.